про важливе становище НАТО відносно оборони України перед військовою агресією Росії у черговому випуску передачі «KYIV, not Kiev» Тетяна Гайдюк і Поліна Бойчук проводять інтерв'ю з головою місії НАТО в Києві Олександром Вінніковим.
Why Ukraine isn't still in NATO?
Would it be correct to say that President Zelensky should ask himself why Ukraine is still not in NATO?
Ukraine will be a member of NATO.
Hello world, it's Kyiv, not Kiev on the line. My name is Polina Boychuk and this is my friend and fellow Tetiana Haiduk.
Today we're having one of my favorite kind of episodes when we're hosting a very special guest. And our guest today is Alexander Vinnikov, head of NATO representation to Ukraine and director of NATO Liaison Office. Alexander, pleasure and honor to have you in our studio. Hello.
Thank you very much.
So let's probably proceed to the most interesting part of our interview, which is about Ukraine and NATO bilateral relations. In his recent interview to the HBO channel, President Zelensky directed a question to the newly elected President of the United States. Why Ukraine isn't still in NATO? But our question to you would be, whom should the President of Ukraine ask this question? Is it really President Biden?
Well, I would start by saying that allies stand by the right of Ukraine to decide its own future. And Ukraine has been a very valued partner of NATO for the past more than 20 years. So clearly our relations have developed very dynamically and I think are beneficial to both sides. With all of this together, NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine on its path to NATO membership, and that's what's important to remember.
Would it be correct to say that President Zelensky should ask himself why Ukraine is still not in NATO? Or is it too early for him to ask himself such a question?
A little bit.
I think it's important to, at this point, to focus on what Ukraine can do to make progress. And there are very clear areas where Ukraine has committed to reform. Ukraine has an annual national program with NATO, which is a very ambitious and strategic reform roadmap where Ukraine outlines the areas where it wishes to implement European and Euro-Atlantic standards. And allies provide feedback, encouragement, and practical support towards those goals. So I think the areas that all allies are focusing and are following very closely in Ukraine are the functioning of democratic institutions, the rule of law, the fight against corruption, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, a functioning market economy. All of these make NATO an alliance of values. It's not simply a military organization, it's a political military alliance and a community of values. So of course every new member that joins has to share those values fully and has to show that its democracy is in line with the standards that the alliance represents and expects.
In June last year, North Atlantic Council recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner. And it's the biggest progress Ukraine has managed to achieve in the bilateral relations so far. What is more in this gesture, practice or symbolism? And could you please explain to our viewers what does it mean to be an enhanced opportunities partners, and what tailor-made opportunities does this status provide or will provide for Ukraine?
Yes, indeed. As you noted, the North Atlantic Council last year recognized Ukraine as one of NATO's enhanced opportunities partners. Ukraine is one of only 6 nations to hold this status, and I think it's a clear recognition of Ukraine's significant contributions to Euro-Atlantic security, not just in recent years, but actually going back all the way until the early 90s. So Ukraine has been a contributor to NATO-led missions, operations, exercises, and also to the NATO response force. So it's a clear recognition that Ukraine is a valuable contributor and a producer of security, not just a consumer of security. So we expect EOP, as we call it, to be a strong driver for future practical cooperation with Ukraine. And the key goal, of course, is to ensure that Ukraine can further enhance its contributions to our operations, exercises, and the NATO response force. So to do this, the EOP will provide tailor-made opportunities for Ukraine to further enhance these contributions. And this tailor-made approach includes privileged access to NATO exercises, including at the planning stage. Also more information sharing, particularly lessons learned. It also provides an opportunity for more intelligence exchange. And the secondment of Ukrainian officers to NATO staffs, so that Ukraine is more strongly represented at the decision-making points. So all of these, I think, constitute quite an attractive package for an EOP partner.
In that context, recently the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Denis Shmyhal, visited Brussels, and after that visit he said that the short-term goal for Ukraine is to get the MAP from NATO. How real is that? Can we really expect that as a short-term goal?
Well, I think this goes back to what I said before about membership. The Bucharest decision stands. It is supported by all allies. And clearly, the Membership Action Plan MAP is an integral part of the membership process. But I think what's important now is to focus on the homework, if you will, if I can call it that. So implementing those reforms that I already outlined in terms of democratic institutions, rule of law, anti-corruption, and other areas, and of course the security and defense sector. Ukraine has an annual national program which provides for NATO support to reforms in these areas, and I think it's important to continue this focus.
Okay, back to the reforms. One of the key reforms, I believe, is the security service. And here we have a question from our friend, and I believe it's a common friend, Sergij Dorenko, an editor of Европейska Pravda, a good friend of ours, who asked us to ask you, who are the main supporters and the main skeptics of the SBU reform in its current shape, I mean, and how is it possible to convince those who are still skeptical?
Well, I agree with the statement that reform of the security service of Ukraine is a key aspect of the reform agenda, and one that will bring Ukraine closer to European and Euro-Atlantic standards. NATO has been working very closely with our partners from the European Union and from the US Embassy in supporting Ukraine's reform process when it comes to the security sector. And clearly the reform of the SBU is a central part of this security sector reform. We have also welcomed the adoption in first reading a few weeks ago of a new draft law on the SBU. We think that the Parliament of Ukraine did a remarkable job in developing this draft with close support from the International Advisory Group, which is NATO, EU, and US. And we have really felt a very constructive attitude from the National Security, Defense and Intelligence Committee in the Rada, other interested members of Parliament, also working closely with the SBU itself and the team that is working on reforms there. So I think it's really a team effort that this draft law was adopted in first reading. Now, of course, a lot of work remains ahead to prepare it for the second reading. And once the law is fully adopted, then of course comes the most difficult phase, which is implementation. I think the key argument to convince any skeptics would be that this reform is needed not for Ukraine's Western partners, but it is needed first and foremost for Ukraine and for the people of Ukraine. Clearly, reforming security and intelligence is one of the most sensitive tasks that any country in transition, in transformation, can do. Many of the NATO members have gone through a similar process in their own countries, coming out of the former Soviet bloc. So we know, many of our allies know how difficult it is exactly, and that is why we are strongly committed to supporting Ukraine every step of the way in this difficult process. I think the vote was very interesting in the Rada because it showed that it's not just the majority faction that is in favor, but there was also a cross-spectrum political consensus, and even members of the opposition voted in favor. And I think it shows that there is a realization that this reform is really in Ukraine's core national interests. And that is why it's very important that this law be adopted, because it will be a central part of the implementation of the law on national security, which of course was adopted back in 2018, again with strong NATO and international support. That law already provides the mandate for the future SBU with 3 core tasks: counter-terrorism, counterintelligence, and the protection of state secrets. So this will be the bedrock of the future SBU. And once adopted, it will clearly be a key milestone on Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic path.
Is it true that Ukraine should give up dreaming about the NATO's membership?
The mission of Ukraine to NATO is headless.
Our cooperation remains very much on track, and this year promises to be another very active year in our NATO-Ukraine cooperation.
Does it mean something?
NATO is here as a friend of Ukraine.